So I've thought about this a lot, and I'm now convinced that there is no one kind of a person who can become an entrepreneur. A lot of people believe that there are certain characteristics that make someone an entrepreneur, and that entrepreneurs are different from non-entrepreneurs or other human beings. So almost as though entrepreneurs are a different species. And I am becoming more and more convinced that that is a very, it's not a very useful way of looking at entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurship is the proverbial ink blot, in the sense that you can be a stick in the mud person with a lot of routine, just for the fun of it, I would say, the accountant type, and you could go start H&R Block, right? Or you could be the ultimate flamboyant guy that you can think of, Richard Branson, and start all kinds of things, including trying to take people to space. So, or you could be a loudmouth like Ted Turner and start CNN. So I actually think I'm more and more convinced that everybody can be an entrepreneur, that entrepreneurship is much more a way of looking at the world and solving problems in the world, like the scientific way, right? Everybody can learn to be a scientist. Not everybody can become an Einstein. That's not what I'm saying. But everybody can actually learn to become more scientific in their reasoning. And in the same way, I think everybody can become more entrepreneurial in their reasoning. And on top of that, because this involves human beings first and foremost, unlike in science where you have to really understand nature and maybe also understand differential equations, here it's much more something that human beings are very good at, interacting with other people in a social setting. And that's why you find millions of women around the world, many of them illiterate, who are entrepreneurs. So I'm becoming more convinced, and I'm beginning to embrace the idea that there is no one type that cannot become an entrepreneur. One is, if you never ever start a venture, right, you're not going to be a successful entrepreneur. So that's a sure thing. I can separate a successful entrepreneur from the unsuccessful one by seeing whether you ever started anything or not. The other one, I think, if you want the surest predictor of success, is how people actually deal with failure. So if you think about this, people will argue that the success rate for ventures is very, very small, 1 in 10. People throw out these numbers. It's actually not quite correct. But whatever the number that you believe is the success rate, if you think about it for a moment, just by being willing to fail once or twice and start again, you can increase the probability of your success, irrespective of what the success rate is out there in the world, right? So those would be the two things I would look for. Somebody who actually acts, who has a bias for action, so will actually go out and try to solve a problem using entrepreneurial methods, if you will, and someone who is willing to do it over again if they did something wrong. And by doing it over again, there's one other thing that you gain, and that is over time you become very good at keeping your failures small and useful, keeping them smart, making them happen at earlier levels of investment. So you actually are able to get more shots at the pot. So failure teaches you not only what not to do, but also how to do things, with a smaller footprint. So if failure happens, it's not disastrous. So that's the way I would think about successful versus unsuccessful. This is a large part of my research. Looks at this notion of what does it mean to think entrepreneurially about a problem, to reason about a problem entrepreneurially, and then most importantly, to act entrepreneurially. So one of the first things about being entrepreneurial is being action-oriented, that you're actually willing to, as I call, do the doable. So you don't wait for the perfect solution. So you're always working on version, 1 point something, because you've already jumped into version 1.0. And that may not be the perfect thing, but you kind of always do the doable and then push it and then push it. So that's, in terms of action, that's one of the things that entrepreneurs do, and that is that they do. And then if you start thinking about what they do, right, then you start beginning to understand a little bit about what does it mean to be entrepreneurial. So one of the things that entrepreneurs are really good at doing, as I told you, especially the experienced ones, is to know to do things in a way that it is not going to involve huge investment outlay. Try to understand how the entrepreneurial worldview is different from other worldviews. Not necessarily from any non-entrepreneurial, but say how is it different from scientific or the religious worldview or maybe a sociological ethos or all these different ways that we could have of looking at the world. The fundamental thing about the entrepreneurial worldview is that you see a role for human action. For example, when you look at where does the future come from, a lot of entrepreneurs, even if they may not state it in so many words, they behave as though the future comes from what you and I do, that what human beings do matters. So they do not come from, say, some kind of inevitable trend. You know, there's nothing that is deterministically or even probabilistically written that this is how it is going to go. Whether it is in terms of a new technology, whether it is in terms of where we are headed as human beings, you know, whether it has to do with economic development or the social development of a human being. You take any problem, the entrepreneurial worldview would suggest that what we do matters and that what we do can make a difference. It may not be all that matters, but it's the first thing in a way that matters. That if you do not do something, then nothing will happen, is something they understand very, very well. So if you try something, you know, you may or may not succeed. But if you do not try something, you know, I can give you a guarantee it ain't going to succeed, right? So it's that kind of a reverse view of success, if you will. A lot of us wait and we think, if I think I could succeed at that, I would try it. An entrepreneur just simply says, you know, here is a problem. I kind of know that the first step would work if I take it, and it looks like I can do it, so let me do it and then push it. Rather than, because what I do will make a difference to the odds. So I don't try to calculate all the odds first. Here I would like to give you the example of Mohammed Yunus, who started Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. Now, people praise him as some kind of heroic visionary, and actually he is, you know, my hero in some ways. But I also study early stage entrepreneurship and how a lot of entrepreneurs who have built these very successful, enduring organizations, how they think. And some of the things you find early on suggests that it was not really the vision that drove them to do. They were looking at something much smaller. In fact, when Mohammed Yunus visited Darden, he actually said this. He said, when I was an economist, you know, I thought big. I could see the big picture. I could see the sequence of events and how things would unfold. And, you know, I had these general theories of the world and about human behavior. Now I'm an entrepreneur. I have like the worm's eye view. I see very few things, very little things, but I see them very, very clearly. And a lot of entrepreneurs are like that. So they see a little problem that is actually fixable and they fix it. And then that opens up new avenues, perhaps new problems. In Mohammed Yunus's case, he came across this village that was devastated and people had lost their livelihoods. And he finds something, I think he mentioned something like 45 people who required a total of $27 worth of capital. Well, he had $27. He gave it. So that's the first step. But that's not the key thing is not just that you and I might have given it too, out of just empathy, if you will, or sympathy. But he went the next step. He started asking, if this is so easily fixable, why isn't it fixed already in a big way? So that the next step is the pushing. So he goes to a bank and he actually asks them, why don't you lend these people money? These are really paltry sums. And then they tell him that these people are unbankable. They are poor. And then he pushes that. And he pushes that. So if you listen to the story, so it's that first step that you do the doable and then you push. and you believe that the pushing is going to make a difference, even though you may not have any guarantee that it will. And I think that is like the essence of the entrepreneurial worldview. If you do not think entrepreneurially, it doesn't mean that you're not going to make any difference in the world. So I want to say it's not entrepreneurial versus non-entrepreneurial. You could be a scientist and you could say that people are dying of smallpox, and what I really want to do is to solve that problem. And that problem obviously is not a question of giving somebody $27 and pushing. Maybe you do need to spend years studying it and working on it. So I want to make it very clear that I do not think of the world as entrepreneurial versus non-entrepreneurial. But the essence of the entrepreneurial worldview is this belief that what we do makes a difference, and that we can push it, and that you keep doing the doable and keep pushing it, and you work with a whole bunch of people and get them to work with you in interesting ways, in creative ways, and all kinds of good things will happen down the road. So that's the entrepreneurial worldview. I presented the entrepreneurial worldview fully born, if you will. But in actual fact, I had to understand that by looking at what entrepreneurs actually do in a micro level, if you will. So in my research, I talked to a whole bunch of, you could call them successful entrepreneurs, but success was only a part of their story. I call them expert entrepreneurs. These are people who had several years of founding experience, of multiple firms, often success and failures, and they had learned to perform well over time. So they had taken at least one company public. So of course people see them as successful entrepreneurs. And when you study how they think, and I gave them a 17-page problem set of typical startup decisions that all entrepreneurs have to make in starting a company. So I got to see at the micro level the kinds of things that they do, not just the whole worldview of how they think, but how they implement that worldview in their practical day-to-day business problem solving, if you will. And I found a series of things that they do. And I wrote about 5 of these, the 5 principles in my book, but I suspect there are more. And I think as I teach and I look at more histories of entrepreneurs and I talk to them, I think there will be more. So I don't want to talk about this, that there are only 5 principles, but I can give you some examples. So one of the things I always talk about to my students and is about cooking. Now I say there are at least 2 ways of cooking. One is to start with a dish that you want to make, and where you have a great recipe, you go get the ingredients and then you make the dish. The other way, the way most of us cook, I think, is we stumble into the kitchen, open the refrigerator and find stuff. And if you come into my house, you'll find things, brown powders that you might have to smell to know what it is in them, because I make Indian food. And so you kind of look at what you have and then you try to make something with it. The interesting question here is, what difference does it make whether you cook using a recipe and proper ingredients or whether you stumble into the kitchen and cook something? It depends on how good a cook you are, what you end up cooking. So you can't get away from the basic ideas that you need to understand about running a business. So you still need to know how to manage your cash flow and things like that. But when you just stumble into the kitchen and cook, what happens is, assuming you know how to cook and you're a good cook, you're much more likely to come up with a new dish that even you might not have actually planned to make. Whereas if you're cooking from a recipe, it would be, you would get that dish, right? You wouldn't get some new dish. And that's the interesting part of it. So it's not really a question of this is better than that. It is just that the way entrepreneurs do it, they work with what they have. And they look around and say, what can I do with this? And then what else can I do with it? So it goes back to the idea of doing the doable and then